The Juneau World Affairs Council, in collaboration with KTOO, presents the 2024 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Political Authoritarianism on the Rise in the 21st Century. In this lecture, The Politics of Memory in the Soviet Union and Post-Soviet Russia, Dr. Tyler Kirk examines the politics of memory in the Soviet Union from the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 to the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian War in 2022.
Hi, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Special thanks to the Juneau World Affairs Council for the honor of the invitation. And it's my first time in Southeast, and I've been totally fascinated and slowly falling in love with this place. It's really beautiful and wonderful despite the rain, which reminds me of our Fairbanks summer this year. When we weren't on fire, it was raining, so it feels cozy. So yeah, I'm Tyler Kirk. I'm a professor of history at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I've done most of my research on the Soviet Union and Soviet history, and it's focused on the Russian far north and the circumpolar north. And so today we're going to talk about the politics of memory, both in the Soviet period and in post-Soviet Russia. And so to start out with a big question, what are the politics of memory? Does anybody want to, I don't know if you'll be able to hear me or not, or hear, if they'll be able to pick you up, but does anybody just want to holler and answer, what are the politics of memory to you? There are no wrong answers. I'll lower the stakes.
Mythology.
Mythology, sure.
Risky.
Risky, okay.
Propaganda.
Propaganda, okay. Do laws come to mind? So politics of memory really encompasses all of the things that you guys just mentioned. But memory laws in particular are one of the things we talk about when we talk about the politics of memory. And specifically thinking about memory politics and the laws regulating memory and history are somewhat of a relatively recent phenomenon dating back to the 80s. Thinking about the historians' debate in Germany about the Holocaust and regulations about what can and cannot be said about history. But in their broadest sense, memory laws and the politics of memory encompasses all laws that regulate collective representations of the past, and in a narrow sense, prohibit things like Holocaust denial and other hate speech. And so memory laws, to start really broadly here in my talk today, we're going to get to Stalin and the Soviet Union and all these other happy topics, that memory laws are a pan-European phenomenon, and they're very much tied to identity and democracy and a unified Europe. But they also all have connections to authoritarian societies and states, and we'll talk about that today too. And so memory laws ultimately defend, if we're going to talk really simply, and we can answer, I could talk more about it in the Q&A, defend state-sponsored memories. And so when we talk about the age of memory, we're talking about this age in the post-war, really post-80s period, where we think about less of master narratives of history. We're moving away from Marxist or neoliberal interpretations of history that sees things as evolving along a timeline, sort of the end of the age of utopianism and a focus more on fragmented experiences, traumas, histories. So very good. Thank you for that early audience participation. And so just a little, I'm gonna Tarantino you a lot. If you've seen his films before, he goes forward and backward. So we're gonna move forward and backward throughout history and maybe do a few circles. So Stalin dies on March 5th, 1953. Millions go into mourning. Some people are pretty excited, obviously, but there's a lot of confusion of what to do, where will we go, what's going to happen next. After Stalin's death, and we'll talk more about the Gulag and political repression shortly, but after Stalin's death, there's this massive amnesty of prisoners from the system of prisons, penal colonies, and labor camps known as the Gulag. You've probably read some Russian literature, Soviet literature in your past about the Gulag, such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn's famous works, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, a real uplifting book, if there ever was one, and really super easy to read, obviously. But Solzhenitsyn documents the camps, and we'll talk more about him in a second. But the amnesties for prisoners after Stalin's death, and that lead into this conversation about memory politics and regulating what can and cannot be said about the past, there was an attempt to reform the system, and they let release about 1.2 of the 2.4 million people that were incarcerated. And of course, during this period of history, when they're trying to figure out a way forward after Stalin's gone, they don't release political prisoners. They release people that had committed crimes that would be crimes in any other country: murder, theft, rape. And so there's this huge crime spree throughout the Soviet Union, and there's this period of confusion and frustration, of course, in the camps amongst the thousands of people that were wrongfully, tens of thousands of people that were imprisoned, exiled, sent away for nothing. And so institutional rather than moral issues drove reform, and that leads a perfect lead into Khrushchev's secret speech. Now, Nikita Khrushchev succeeded Joseph Stalin. He was one of the Stalinist old guard in the Soviet Union. He was promoted through the ranks of the party under Stalin, and is sort of one of Stalin's men. And so there's a limit to what Khrushchev can say and denounce about Stalin without implicating himself. And so the secret speech, which happens in February 24th to 25th, 1956, so about 3 years after Stalin's death, is this attempt to come to terms with mass repression under Stalin. This well-known secret that mass repressions had happened in the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of people had been executed during the Great Terror, 1937, 1938, and then approximately a total of 25 million people had been sent into exile or sent to prisons or sent to labor camps. Historians debate the high and low ends of those numbers, so these are all approximate, and we'll never know the true number, but about 25 million go in and out of the camps. It's a revolving door. And so Khrushchev is tasked with this attempt to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union, to try and make a system that's not based upon one man's rule, but to reestablish the rule of the Communist Party and to reestablish Marxist-Leninist principles and sort of protect Soviet institutions, if you will. We were talking a lot about authoritarianism. Soviet Union definitely qualifies for that label as an authoritarian government, if not totalitarian, and we can talk about totalitarianism versus authoritarianism if we want during the Q&A. But Khrushchev really wanted to move society forward, and in order to do that, he had to address what had happened in the Stalin period. And so part of his speech, and I'll read a quote to you guys here, was designed to peel back the curtain on what had happened under Stalin without totally delegitimizing the system, and that became really tricky to do, and we'll talk about that here shortly. And so Khrushchev said during his secret speech, quote, "We know now that the people who suffered during the repressions were innocent. We have indisputable proof that far from being enemies of the people, they were honest men and women, devoted to the party, devoted to the revolution, devoted to the Leninist cause, and to building socialism and communism in the Soviet Union. We can't keep people in exile or in the camps any longer. We must figure out how to bring them back." And so, let me flip the page here. And so many were bewildered, not by the content necessarily of Khrushchev's speech, but by the fact that the party even chose to talk about it at all. This was a really huge revelation. It was a secret speech in that it was not supposed to necessarily be broadcast throughout the Soviet Union, but it leaked out of the Soviet Union, and local, in the sort of chaos of the post-Stalin, early post-Stalin era, people found out about this speech. And so the main question that faced Soviet people at the time in the wake of Stalin's death, and this is a question that we'll talk about again throughout this presentation, is how do we distinguish the good from the bad? Who are the perpetrators and who are the victims? Who do we remember as perpetrators and who do we mourn as victims? And so that was a major question. The what, the why, the how, and the who were also major questions. And at the time, Khrushchev was only willing to acknowledge party members that had suffered under Stalin, that had been executed or sent away. And we'll return to this again when we talk about Gorbachev and the era of glasnost and perestroika that come at the end of the 1980s. And so during this period of time, the silences in Khrushchev's speech, the things he chose not to say, provoked a lot of protest in Soviet society, and that victims also became some of the chief historians. So going back to Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a Gulag prisoner himself, was one of the first to write and publish on the quote-unquote camp theme, as it was dubbed during the Soviet period. And so this leads us into the work that I've done, which focuses on how former prisoners readapted to life after release in the Soviet Union in my book, and also how they shaped the cultural memory of Stalinist repression, how they contributed to an alternate history of the Soviet Union as it was collapsing, and how they shaped how Stalinist repression was remembered, in the years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is a memory that is really important to think about. It's something, and we'll talk about this more throughout the talk, it's something that the government has already acknowledged, but it's something that is damaging, greatly damaging to this attempt to create a patriotic, neo-imperial narrative of history. And I'm talking about the state's attempt to create a patriotic, neo-imperial narrative of history that borrows the achievements of the Soviet era, the successes, the victory in World War II, sending the first man into space, all of these great achievements, and claiming them as, achievements of the Russian state. And so we'll talk about sort of the retrofitting of Soviet symbols, trying to get the 3-inch stovepipe to fit into a 4-inch stove jack or something like that, to use a wood stove analogy. And so, if I go back real quick? There we go. And so one of the other key things about my book, and that is so fundamental to this conversation about authoritarianism and the politics of memory throughout the world, is that alternate histories, and these narratives that individuals can contribute to overturning state-sponsored historical narratives are really important to understanding democratic processes. These are people who had been excised from Soviet life, who've been cast away, exiled, imprisoned. Obviously, the people that were shot could not testify, but that they contribute to this effort to better understand the dark chapters of history and in hopes of a democratic future. And sadly, the book that I researched and wrote is about a country that no longer exists. This project is currently dead in Russia today. It is embattled, and we can talk more about that, the complexity of it. But I wanted to highlight this this idea of an alternate history, of history from below. So we often, when we talk about authoritarian regimes, we think about top-down rule, we think about top-down approaches to culture, and the narratives, the shaping of narratives that states and societies, regimes tell about themselves and the societies that they govern are really important to understanding. Social control. This is a map of the Komi region. It is a map of the region that I spent years of my life in and dedicating research to, either being physically there or mentally there, researching the system of labor camps, special settlements for exiles, in prisons that encompassed the region. This is a region of, as you can see it here on the map, this is a region in the extreme northeastern corner of European Russia. If you can imagine the Ural Mountains dividing the continent right there, it's nestled in the northeastern corner up against the polar Ural Mountains. And so this is a map that shows the evolution of the Gulag, that the Soviet prison system in the region over time, starting with the first expedition in 1929 in search of oil in the region, and its evolution and expansion into labor camps that were responsible for the colonization and extraction of resources using forced labor. I chose Komi as a site of research specifically because it was emblematic of other regions that had been colonized by forced labor throughout the Soviet Union, but also for its uniqueness. 6 of Komi's 7 cities were built by prisoners. Almost all of its infrastructure, the railroad that you take to get all the way north to Vorkuta in the Arctic, the coal mining city in the Arctic, were built by prisoners. And so this question about narratives and who built what is very physically felt in the region. Monuments, and we'll talk about this, I keep promising for later, kicking cans down the road. Cities become monuments in the late Soviet period, in the early post-Soviet period, not to socialist achievement, but they're redesignated as monuments to the suffering and achievements of the prisoners who built them, and we'll talk about that process. But again, the Gulag was a prison system. About 25 million people are imprisoned or exiled in the Soviet Union. It includes thousands of prisons, camps, exile settlements across the breadth and length of the Soviet Union, all the way from the west, the Kola Peninsula in the west, to the Russian Far East, not too far from where we are in Alaska, north and south, even in European Russia. When we think about the Gulag, we might often think of scenes of Siberia or Siberian exile, but many of the camps were actually in the European part of Russia, and some of them were just around Moscow itself, for use of construction of infrastructure, canals, railroads, the metro. And so the Gulag served not only as a prison system, but it served the needs of the Soviet economy and theoretically the reforging of wayward citizens. The Bolsheviks wanted to, after their October Revolution, wanted to create a prison system in which people would not just rot, but that what's the most honorable thing you can do in a socialist laborer state? Labor, right? And so labor would correct these people. Of course, the camps were so brutal and conditions were so awful in them that people usually just died. And so there's a debate about the lip service of this ideology of reforging people. However, it is important to, especially when we talk about and think about authoritarianism, to take ideology seriously, right? To think about what regimes say, about what their goals are, and then compare that with their practices. So the Gulag existed roughly between 1930 and 1960, and then there was a major overhaul of the Soviet prison system. And there are still penal colonies, of course. Alexei Navalny just died in one in February of this year. We're still in 2024, yeah? In February of this year, Alexei Navalny passed away in a penal colony. And so there's a connection we'll talk about between the Gulag and the Russian penal system today. But the practice of mass incarceration dies with Stalin. The camps were unsustainable. They were a drain on the Soviet economy. Stalin's advisors, I won't say the word begged, tried to convince him gently that they were wasteful, and this went nowhere until he was gone. So the Komi region, I also want to mention that this had been the homeland and still is the homeland of the indigenous Finno-Ugric people, the Komi people. They are a semi-nomadic reindeer herding people related to the Sami. Starting in the late 18th century, but really picking up in the 19th century, it was a dumping ground for the Tsar's exiles, right? And so it has a history of a region as a region of exile. In the late 80s, after decades of colonization through forced labor and construction and rehoming of people, I guess you could say, this region becoming home for exiles and prisoners who had been released from the camps and released from exile. that by the 80s, when these people start to come forward, and we'll talk about that moment here in a few minutes, it becomes known as the capital of the quote-unquote Camp Republic. And so this is a history that is very much felt in the memories of people in the, I hope that's not Putin calling. It's a memory that's felt in this region and seen in this region. And so over the course of the 30s and 50s, Khomeini's prisoner population, just to give you some numbers, and we'll talk more about qualitative things as we go forward, grows from 10,000 in 1932 to roughly 242,000 by 1950. And there's a constant revolving door of prisoners coming and leaving the area. These are typically people who are convicted for labor crimes, theft, murder. These are the people that are let out and allowed to leave. Political prisoners, however, exiles, are usually remanded to the region. If they are not forced to stay in the region, they are given a passport with a mark in it that identifies who they are, and they can't live within 101 kilometers of any major city. And so if you really can't go home, or you don't have a home to go back to, and you already know the boss at the local coal mine, people would often be released from the camp and go back to work in that same mine, but as free laborers, as citizens, because they usually didn't have anywhere else to go. And I'll give you some examples of that. All right, 33 minutes left. I got a boogie. And so this brings me to a conversation about prisoners and about memory, and we're going to go back to 1956. I told you we were going to go back and forward in time. I'm making good on that promise. And so in the wake of Stalin's death, and in the wake of Khrushchev's attempt to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union, to pull back the curtain and say, let's have a conversation about what happened, there's a lot of chaos. People don't know what to say. Some people are obviously really upset about this denunciation of Stalin. Others use it as an opportunity to commemorate the dead and to have an earnest conversation about Soviet history, to take the good with the bad, so to speak. And so on July 29th, 1956, a group of Latvian prisoners in Inta, which is here, just below the Arctic Circle, really. Inta. It was a coal mining town, small town, built out of a forced labor camp. Prisoners in July 1956, Latvians, had formed a mutual aid society. So a mutual aid society, a group of friends, of people, comrades in unhappiness, as they called themselves, who made friends in the camps, made acquaintances in the camps in order to survive. Right? That's one of the things that from the memoir literature that counters what Varlam Shalamov, another famous survivor and dissident, had written, that there's no friendship, there's no connection in the camps at all. But the survivors that, the testimonies that I read in the archives in the Russian Far North testify to the very importance of this quote-unquote camp brotherhood in surviving the camps, but also making their way after release and finding a place in Soviet society, readapting. And so this Latvian camp brotherhood, in this period of chaos and disorder, take it upon themselves to use materials, and this is totally fascinating. This is from a KGB report that I found in the archives. This is a KGB officer snapped this photo, that prisoners in the camps used materials from the camp to build this monument. An imprisoned artist designed this monument, and then they moved it in pieces outside the camp, and the people that are no longer imprisoned put it together. And this is standing at the gates to a prisoner cemetery where many Latvians were buried. There are many different ethnic groups imprisoned in Soviet camps. The Soviet Union was a highly diverse, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, multi-confessional empire. But the Latvians took the initiative of this time to build a monument. And I'm going to share a little tiny piece from the report, a little teaser that's in the book. And this is from the KGB report. So as one speaker, a Latvian by the name of Krastinš said, "We unveil this monument to the departed daughters and sons who as victims of arbitrariness will never see the motherland again. The memory of them will forever live in our hearts." Quote, "The individuals who were summoned to the city Soviet stated that in taking part in the construction and unveiling of the monument, they thought that the initiators of the construction had agreed with the city Soviet that they did not for knowingly violate any Soviet laws. And as a result of conducting these conversations on the quote-unquote illegal acts of the Latvians, the Lithuanian and Estonian nationalists ceased the construction of similar monuments." And that's the end of the report. The report goes on and on to talk about prophylactic measures that were taken and conversations that were had, but astonishingly, no arrests were made, and the monument was not torn down. They just prevented other prisoners from erecting monuments. And my argument about this one in particular is that prisoners framed it as a gravestone marker and not as a monument to the victims of Stalinist repression to veil what they were ultimately trying to do. Now, this monument languished for many years. It was abandoned when the camps were closed. You can see in the background, this is one of the commandant's houses. There are other people who had been buried here. There are some areas where prisoners are just dumped into mass graves and then buried all together. But this is somewhat of a unique cemetery. But 33 years after it had been erected, on August 23rd, 1989, the Zimtene monument, which means to the motherland in Latvian, I should have said that earlier, made headlines again in Komi when it was once again the focus of this project of coming to terms with Stalinist repression. In 1985 and onward, Gorbachev, who is now in power, Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, comes to power and again wants to democratize and de-Stalinize Soviet society. And so his number one goal is returning to this conversation that had been halted under Khrushchev just because it was unsustainable. People started to come forward and say things that were unpalatable to the party. And so 33 years after the monument had been first erected, this monument makes headlines again on August 23rd, 1989, when the central Komi newspaper, the central regional newspaper, Molodozh Severa, reported on the restoration and rededication of the monument and the abandonment of the cemetery, which had been attended by local residents, people who had not been repressed, as well as the children, the descendants, and survivors of people who had been imprisoned in the region and exiled, who first unveiled it in 1956. One of them, Alfred Gaidans, a 77-year-old former prisoner, traveled all the way from Latvia to attend the ceremony, and he corrected Molodozh Severa's initial report that this was a Latvian monument for Latvians and how nice that the Latvians commemorated their dead. And so this 77-year-old Gulag survivor travels from Latvia all the way to the Russian far north, and he proclaims that the monument is, quote, not only a tribute to the memory of Latvians who became victims of Stalin's repressions, but also a warning to all future peoples, Russians, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Germans, Jews. The fates of the prisoners of the Gulag archipelago must never be repeated. And so here we have in this moment of relaxed censorship, in this attempt to reform Soviet society, people begin to come forward and redesignate and reclaim monuments to their own suffering or monuments to victims of political repression. And this theme of commemorating the dead is a really big one that we'll see again in the rest of the presentation, of this effort to lay to rest the people who didn't survive Stalinist repression and to make sense of and to bring to closure to this period of history in which people simply disappeared into the tundra and taiga and were never heard from again. And this becomes one of the most palatable to the regime, to the Soviet regime, and then the early post-Soviet regime methods of commemorating Stalin's victims. So it's okay to commemorate the dead, but it becomes a different thing when remembering Stalin's victims becomes a vehicle for criticizing the regime and its crimes against humanity. I mentioned a newspaper article that the quote came from. There was a huge debate. Next slide, wow, magical. There was a huge debate in Soviet newspapers from the period. And in the book and in my research, I really made efforts to focus on regional perspectives. I really wanted to understand what this massive history that involved millions of people looked like when you look at it from a regional perspective. And so looking at the regional newspapers and local newspapers, which frankly echoed conversations that were happening nationally, but with a local flavor, that there was this huge conversation about victimhood. And because of this era of relaxed censorship, there's of course a limit to what can and cannot be said, but people are increasingly criticizing Soviet idols, Soviet authorities. And then I share this one image right here. Here we have Stalin sitting next to Molotov and Voroshilov, all high party officials, and next to their names are the acronyms for different versions of enemies of the people that were applied to victims of Stalinist repression. And it says special committee, and that is another term used to refer to the special committees that were used to sentence people extrajudicially to execution, exile, and imprisonment. And so this was a massive, if you can imagine, the Stalin period, no conversation. The Khrushchev period, an attempt to have a limited conversation on it, but then once Khrushchev is ousted, if I'm getting my dates wrong, in '64, Brezhnev comes to power and he goes, well, we're not going to totally disavow what Khrushchev said, but we're not going to continue the conversation. People who suffered in the camps are heroes, and there's an attempt to make patriotic narratives out of this talk, out of this time. But this was new. I mean, this is really revolutionary, especially in an authoritarian society like the Soviet Union. But it was part of this effort to democratize the Soviet Union and to democratize Soviet society. And it was a part of an effort to make sense of who is actually to blame, who is guilty. Unlike Germany, the Soviet Union was never defeated. It collapsed. And so there was no Nuremberg trial. And there was this talk about having a trial for the Communist Party, and there was this attempt to have a trial for the Communist Party in the post-Soviet period, but it really doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't produce anything. In one newspaper report from the time, one interview, there was a KGB officer who defected, not to the West, but left his post, retired from his post early. He was a historian. He worked with archives. And he basically says that I could name the names of people who executed people in Komi, who sent them into exile. But if I did that tomorrow, people would rip this person to shreds. And who's guilty, this individual person or the Communist Party as a whole? And so there's real hesitancy to have a conversation, to have a trial for perpetrators in the Soviet Union, and it gets even worse in post-Soviet Russia, as we'll see. It doesn't really go anywhere. But the victims, who the victims are, become increasingly clear. Ordinary people read these, who had been repressed, read these newspaper stories, and they say, well, wait a minute, you're only talking about party members again, or you're only talking about people like Trotsky, or you're only talking about other high party officials and communists. Well, I was a communist, or I wasn't a communist, but I suffered too. And so a lot of ordinary people come out of the woodworks to contribute to this broadening definition of victims of political repression, as the official term was. And it mattered because there were laws on the rehabilitation of victims of political repression. Going back to this conversation about memory laws, there were attempts to quote unquote rehabilitate in the sense of expunge people's records and give them some sort of recognition that they had not done anything wrong and that they had suffered unjustly, and to give them some sort of measly compensation. In the Soviet period and in the post-Soviet period, veterans had this sacred status, and there was this conversation about giving them bus passes and some sort of pension buffers and other things like that. So it was a really meaningful conversation. And so Gorbachev relaxes the controls on censorship. And pretty soon after that, in 1987, 88, 89, people start to come forward. And eventually, one of Russia's oldest civic organizations, human rights organizations, forms. And that's the International Memorial Society. How many of you have ever heard of the Memorial Society before? Okay, great. You're here. We're here to learn. And so the International Memorial Society was one of the Soviet Union's and Russia's first civic organizations. It forged out of a coalition of those who had not been repressed and those who had been victims of Stalinist violence and their children. And so it begins in the late 80s, and during this moment of this like truth-seeking and truth-telling, and they organize a week of conscience in Moscow in 1989. And this very quickly spreads through the press and through word of mouth throughout the Soviet Union to the remote regions of the Soviet Union. And eventually we have branches of the Memorial Society, which had been founded in Moscow in the Komi Republic, very shortly after. We're talking like weeks and months after. Because of course, there were lots of people, the same people who had not been repressed, but also those who had been repressed, joining forces together to tell these stories and form a people's archive, and we'll talk about that in a second. But during the Week of Conscience in Moscow, there was this attempt to make sense of individual lives. People didn't have access to archives like, I was going to say we do now, like we did until very recently. People didn't have access to archives, and so they used their personal archives, their family documents, the letters, the testimonies, the arrest records, photographs, artwork, memoirs, things that people had scribbled for the drawer for posterity and hidden away. And they all bring them forward, and that's what this image depicts, is this massive wall of people. These are lives. Individual people who had been excised out of Soviet history, and they're trying to write themselves back into history, Soviet history, almost at its end. And so this was a massive effort that led to the culmination of the civic organization, and the Soviet Union collapses, and there's this growth of this nascent civil society. It seems like a real triumph of democracy, and this project, this memory project of understanding and coming to terms with the crimes of Stalin. And so, again, all of this Week of Conscience and the growth of the Memorial Society, which formed branches throughout the Soviet Union, led to the creation of people's archives. And so one of the things I originally really wanted to understand is how the regime adapted to these changes and made sense of the crimes of the Stalin era. And what did they do with these people that were evidence, their lives were evidence of how the regime had betrayed its Marxist-Leninist principles, had gone back on the revolution, how the revolution essentially had eaten its own children, right? A very familiar story through history. And so the kinds of sources I found that the prisoners had donated, their children had donated, they did not donate them to state and party archives. Surprise, surprise. They didn't trust these institutions with their personal sources, personal archives. So they donated them to local history museums, they donated them to the Memorial Society. And this, when I began working on this topic in the wake of Crimea in 2014, became a way to, this history laid breadcrumbs that led me directly to these archives. And it became this fascinating experiment. And so questionnaires, memoirs, letters, newspapers, personal archives, photographs from doctors who had been sentenced and sent to the camps and then enlisted to work as doctors in camp clinics were there. Photographs of monuments, artwork, and we'll talk about artwork as a form of autobiographical narrative here in a second. And we're gonna move forward. We're gonna boogie. And so these collected memories that I refer to the diverse, often conflicting memories of survivors, and that memory draws from socially constructed frameworks to articulate experiences But ultimately, the memories that people are sharing are their own. And so this term collected memories, and when we talk about cultural memory, is the transition of traumatic past or other memories institutionally over time to future generations. You know, the panelists went to the State Museum the other day, and that is a great example of an institution of cultural memory to transmit history to future generations who didn't experience it. And so this is the materials that I was working with, and this is the materials of the Week of Conscience in the Memorial Society. And so what are they writing against? Going back to politics of memory, what are they writing against? They're writing against the centralized narratives that the Communist Party and the Soviet state had put forward through histories, just regular old books, if people used to read books, through books, through newsreel films, newspaper stories, artistic films. The Soviet Union was a huge producer of films. And so this is an example of a newsreel film called Along the Pechora Road. And it depicts the history of Vorkuta, right? The history of this Arctic coal mining town that started as a prison camp. Guess what? There's not a single mention of a prisoner. There's not a single mention of Stalinist repression. But all of the people depicted in this film, guess what? These are all former prisoners. These are all people who still work in the coal mine. This was footage of a city that grew up on the tundra, that was built on the tundra by forced labor. And so prisoners come forward in the late 80s when they're finally given the chance to do so in order to rewrite history. They, for decades, have been afraid. They had signed non-disclosure agreements. They had been fearful of what would happen if they spoke out. Because, again, Khrushchev says, let's talk about this. Brezhnev says, no, we're not going to talk about this. Then Gorbachev says, okay, let's talk about it again. So there's this real fear that the lid is going to be slammed on their hands again and that there are going to be consequences. But enough time had passed. The survivors were very elderly at this point, and they were willing to come forward. So in coming forward, I said we'd come back to funerals and to monuments commemorating the dead. This was the early form that many survivors and Memorial focused on, was finding places, mass graves, which was actually pretty easy to do in some instances. When they would go to bulldoze the foundations for a new apartment building, they would find a giant pile of human remains, and many of them had a small hole in the back of the skull. And so these were very clearly mass graves from the Stalin era. This happens today. In Russia, they will go to bulldoze a site in the Komi region, and they'll find another mass grave, and they'll send in investigators and be like, nope, this wasn't some serial killer, this was from the 30s. And so there was a huge focus in the early days on commemorating the dead, laying the dead to rest in an attempt to mourn the victims and set up the rituals for the future commemoration of these victims and to realign the state's politics of memory. Other monuments take on a more experimental form. This monument, ultimately, the monument to the victims of political repression in Vorkuta, was erected in 1989. And it was meant to be a placeholder monument. This is a fundament stone that was part of the camp's foundation. And it's in the background of, in the background you can see a mine that was that had been originally built by prisoners, right, by forced labor. And then we have the development over time of a Catholic cross here. You can see in the corner over there, very small, in 1997. And then there's a sort of multiplication of different monuments to different groups, to independent groups. And there's a splintering of memory from victims of political repression writ large, the further we move into the post-Soviet period, into monuments to individual groups, whether they're Germans, Ukrainians, Poles, everyone. There's universal suffering. But at the same time, we have survivors saying, well, what is left of their labor? Every one of the millions of the toilers of the Gulag left their own mark. Everyone has their own monument. And he's talking about Konstantin Flug, who was a dyed-in-the-wool communist. He was hopeful that communism could be saved. He wanted to save communism. He was a Gulag survivor. Fascinating fascinating person. But he made the argument that the city itself was a monument. That regardless of whether or not the Communist Party ever approved the construction of a monument in Moscow or anywhere else, that the things that prisoners themselves built had been given meaning by the narratives that they put out into the world and transformed from monuments to socialist achievement, because that's the narrative of along the Pechora Road. Like, good communists went out into the tundra and built a city in the middle of nowhere. And people like Konstantin Flug are saying, no, well, we built that. As we move into the 2000s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we're going to go forward and then we're going to go back again. There's an attempt to blend religious commemoration with the politics of memory, and also think about mourning the dead. And this monument, outright on the surface in Syktyvkar, the capital of the Komi region, it looks like an Orthodox chapel. But when you get up close to it, and you can see, you note this plinth here in the corner where there's a little marble plinth that contains the soil from each of the major camp complexes as a way for people who no longer live in these remote regions to mourn their dead. When you get up close to it, you can see, and there's the plinth right there. I didn't know if I had a photo of it in the slides. As you get up close to it, you can see it's a mosaic of scenes from life in the camps. There are things prisoners experienced, the names of people, the names of places where people had been imprisoned. And so this monument was the result of a contest to design a monument for the Komi capital, a local contest to design the monument. And this monument was this attempt to create a monumental mosaic that represented something for everyone. There were examples of monuments that I document in the book of these like sort of abstract gargantuan figures dragging away this tiny little person versus very overt religious imagery and focused again on commemorating the dead and religious ritual. But this was an attempt to make a monument for everybody. And so one of the other case study examples that I wanted to talk about, because I talked a lot about memoirs and literary monuments and letters and other written documents, but artwork became an important medium for expressing what had happened and testifying to the past. This is obviously a super traumatic history. It's something that people really struggled to speak about. And this man, Konstantin Ivanov, was a young man when he was sent away. And he was imprisoned in Vorkuta in the Arctic, sent to heavy labor. His life was saved by being transferred to work as what's the English word? The drafter, like somebody that drew architectural designs, and as a set designer for the camp theater. Yes, there was a theater in the Gulag. If you have a question about that, we can talk about it. But Ivanov wrote letters to the local history museum. He could not bring himself to write a memoir of his experiences. He wrote about life after release. He wrote about the community of artists, the Camp Brotherhood that I mentioned earlier. But he drew his memories of life in the camps. His letters are rife with silences. They're heavy silences, which about things he cannot bring himself to testify about, but he does it with his artwork. And so artwork enters the conversation in symbols that prisoners painted and drew, enter sort of the discourse about history and memory in the Soviet Union and in the post-Soviet space that are become very powerful and very meaningful. Ivanov's work depicts violence in the camps, violence at the hands of criminals. Ordinary criminals plagued political prisoners violently. Gang leaders plagued people. He also documents love and tenderness in the camps. This is a theme. Separation of men and women in the camps was a rule. However, connections were formed and made in the camps. Children were born in the camps. And he documents, I have a photograph of this almost exact same. This was drawn about 30 years after his release. And I have a photograph that shows this exact scene from the era. And he drew these scenes from his memory in a very powerful way. He drew faces. He very famously, In the Soviet period, in the years after his release, he continued to work as an artist, and he entered art competitions in Moscow, and he sent one very famous painting. Do I have it? Nope. One very famous painting that takes up the entire screen, and it's all different coal miners with the numbers removed from their hats. And it went out under the label of like miners of the polar stokehold, like heroes of socialism. And only in the late 80s was he able to go back and redraw it as he originally intended, with prisoner numbers on their hats. He describes and documents mass death in the camps, and talks about the brutality. I mean, I featured a lot about life and survival in the camps, but there was obviously lots of death. And so this brings us to this moment in 1991, right? The Soviet Union collapses in 1991, and there's almost this immediate reckoning, right, after the failed August Putsch, in which the communist hardliners tried to remain in power, keep Soviet power, and almost immediately after this, there's this movement, this effort to take down Felix Dzerzhinsky's statue. Felix Dzerzhinsky, if you don't know, was the founder of the Cheka, the original secret police in the Soviet Union. His statue stood outside of the Lubyanka building in Moscow, the KGB building on Lubyanka Square, and it was a monument to like iron discipline and repression. And so it's taken away in 1991. There's this mass effort to rip down symbols of communism in hopes for a democratic future, right? Russia's perhaps second or only democratic revolution. Then you come to 2017, and this was erected on October 30, or unveiled on October 30th, 2017, after decades. So going back to Khrushchev's speech, this attempt to think about how to commemorate the victims of political repression, who to blame for the perpetrators. We're firmly in the Putin era. And there are many other monuments that are erected, but for the sake of brevity, I had to make some choices. But this is the official state monument to the victims of political repression. It's tucked away outside of the center of Moscow. It is supposed to resemble a wall of people, a wall of victims. And Putin unveiled this monument standing alongside Patriarch Kirill and Solzhenitsyn's widow and other people. And despite it being an acknowledgement of the state, that Stalin, of course, had committed crimes and that there were victims of political repression, there are many activist people from Memorial who were very unhappy with it, specifically because Putin said the following at the monument, and there were criticisms of the monument itself, that he said, quote, "We and our successors must remember the tragedy of repressions and their causes, but it does not mean one must call for revenge. Nobody can push society to the dangerous line of confrontation again," end quote. And so there's this real effort to put a limit in post-Soviet Russia on this conversation about victims of political repression and state crimes, because the state wants to, again, recycle old symbols. I mean, there's this big celebration. Everybody knows about Victory Day celebrations in Russia, celebrating the Soviet victory in World War II. Despite the fact that there are Red Army flags and soldiers dressed up in World War II garb, this sort of renewed focus on the Soviet victory is a part of this effort to strip the victory of its Soviet-era content, right? This communist content, the communist symbolism behind the event, meaning behind the event, and then retrofit it as a victory of the Russian Federation, right? This is a Russian victory. Whereas in the Soviet period, it was acknowledged as a victory of the peoples of the Soviet Union. And so, to fast forward to the present moment, after the erection of the Wall of Sorrow in 2017, there's a return of Dzerzhinsky to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Intelligence, the Foreign Spies Ministry, the SVR headquarters in September 2023. The head of this organization unveiled a new Felix Dzerzhinsky statue that is very similar to the original. The original is in the Garden of Fallen Heroes in Moscow, outside the modern Tretyakov Gallery. And so it's a resurrection of the security state in the celebration of the symbols of the security state. And I want to end on this moment with the last minute I have. So there's been this effort to, the Memorial Society was banned by the Russian Supreme Court in 2021. Of course, Russia invades Ukraine in February 2022, and then it's awarded the Nobel Peace Prize the following year. But the relevance of this monument, this is the Solovetsky stone. This was the stone from the first concentration camp in the Soviet Union, and it was placed outside of on Lubyanka Square right after Dzerzhinsky was pulled down. And in the wake of Navalny's murder, people were laying flowers at this monument and repurposing a monument to Stalin's victims as a monument to the victims of political repression in Putin's Russia. And so I'll leave it there because we're out of time, but happy to talk about this in the Q&A. Yeah, thanks.
That was Dr. Tyler Kirk discussing the politics of memory in the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia. It was recorded October 18, 2024 at KTOO on the unceded territories of the Occoquan on Tlingit Ani as part of the 2024 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Political Authoritarianism on the Rise in the 21st Century. Produced by KTOO and the Juneau World Affairs Council. With support from Core Alaska Kensington Mine,